The listening post at the edge of known space was never meant to find anything important, and the crew of 6 insectoid Cathari who worked there had accepted long ago that their careers had been quietly buried in the deepest corner of the galaxy. Tyvan Sarathi was the youngest among them, and he spent most of his shifts staring at data streams that never changed, and drinking warm nutrient broth that always tasted like metal and dust combined into something that offended all 4 of his hands every time he raised the cup. But on the 407th day of his rotation, something changed. A pulse hit the receiver array with so much force that 2 of the backup systems triggered emergency shutdowns, and the main console screamed in alarm that Tyvan had never heard before in his entire training or his time on Station Valley 9. He set down his cup, and all 4 of his hands moved across the controls at once, pulling up the signal data and trying to make sense of it. What the instruments were telling him. The signal was not encoded in any known Concord cipher, and it was not compressed or filtered or shaped in any of the ways that civilized species transmitted information across the void between stars. It was raw and loud, and absolutely unafraid of being heard. Tyvan ran the translation matrix 3 times, because the first 2 results made no sense, and the third result made even less sense, but at least it was consistent. The signal said one thing, and it repeated that one thing over and over and over again, like a heartbeat pushing through the dark. "We heard you, and we are coming to help." Tyvan felt his exoskeleton go cold from his head down to the base of his thorax, and he pulled up the directional trace and followed the signal back to its origin point. It came from the Sol Arm. Every species in the Galactic Concord knew about the Sol Arm, the way every child knew about the monster that lived in the deep water beneath the bridge in old stories. And you did not go there, and you did not talk about it, and you certainly did not expect anything to come out of it. The Sol Arm had been quarantined 4,000 years ago, when Concord survey teams first cataloged the 3rd planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. And the report that came back was so horrifying that the Grand Arbiter at the time had sealed the entire region and classified the native species as a Category 12 existential hazard. The planet was a nightmare wrapped in a thin layer of breathable atmosphere, and the creatures that lived on it survived tectonic upheaval and ice ages and mass extinction events and oceans full of predators and air full of toxins. And they did not just survive. They thrived and multiplied and built things and broke things and fought each other with such ferocity that the survey team concluded they would destroy themselves long before they ever reached the stars. Wrong. Tyvan sent the data to Concord High Command and waited. And when the response came back, it was from Grand Arbiter Yulin personally, which meant either Tyvan was about to be promoted or he was about to disappear. Yulin was ancient even by Palathi standards, and the Palathi were a gaseous species that could live for 1,000 years, drifting through the halls of power like sentient fog with opinions. And Yulin had governed the Concord for 6 centuries, with the kind of patient calm that came from being functionally immortal and deeply tired of everyone else. The Grand Arbiter dismissed the signal as an echo or a malfunction, or perhaps a scath trick designed to create panic along the border. The Scath Dominion had been eating Concord worlds alive for decades now, and the war was going badly. But that was classified information, and the public believed everything was under control, because the public always believed everything was under control, right up until the end. Moment it was not. Tyvan wanted to believe the Grand Arbiter was right, and he wanted to go back to his warm broth and his boring data streams, and his quiet, uneventful career at the edge of nowhere. Then the second signal arrived. This one was different because it carried data, and the data was terrifying in its precision. Star charts of over 30 Concord systems, rendered with accuracy that suggested long and careful observation, from somewhere that should not have had the technology to observe anything at all. Atmospheric composition analyses of inhabited worlds, with notations about which gases were breathable, and which species lived where, and what their biological tolerances were. And at the end, a short message that hit Tyven harder than the first signal ever had. Your distress beacons in the Vaynari corridor have been active for 11 years, and we have been listening, and we need to know why no one in your government has responded to your own. People calling for help. Tyven knew about the Vaynari corridor because everyone in the military knew about it, even if the public did not. The Vaynari were a gentle amphibian species who glowed with soft bioluminescence, and they had colonized a string of worlds along the Concord border. And when the Scath Dominion pushed into that region, the Vaynari had activated emergency distress beacons and called for help. That was 11 years ago. The Concord had debated and discussed and formed committees and issued statements of concern, and the Scath had continued to burn and consume, and the Vaynari had continued to die, and the beacons had continued to pulse their desperate rhythm into the void. And someone had heard them. Not the Concord with its 4,000-member species and its vast fleets and its ancient wisdom. Someone else. Tyven pulled up the long-range sensor array and aimed it at the Sol arm, and what he saw made every joint in his body lock. With pure, involuntary terror, 300 ships were moving through the quarantine zone in tight formation, and they were moving fast, and they were not slowing down. The ships were ugly in a way that offended every aesthetic principle the Concord valued in spacecraft design, and they were angular and heavy, and covered in what looked like armor plating, bolted onto more armor plating, and they bristled with redundant systems and backup systems for the backup systems. They were not built for beauty or efficiency or grace. They were built by something that expected to be hit, and expected to be hurt, and expected to keep going anyway. Tyven contacted High Command again, and this time his message was short. The quarantine has failed, and they are coming, and there are 300 of them, and Grand Arbiter, I do not think they are going to ask for permission. He sat back in his chair and watched the icons move across his screen like a slow tide rolling toward a shore that had never known waves, and he thought about the message buried in that second signal. Why has no one responded? He did not have an answer, and he suspected that when the beings behind those ugly, magnificent, terrible ships arrived, they would want one. The stars in the Sol arm burned the same as any other stars, but Tyven could not shake the feeling that tonight they burned a little brighter and a little angrier than before, and somewhere out there, in the dark between worlds, something old and fierce and patient was finally done waiting. The colony world of Aethan IV had been dying for 3 years, and the Vaynari who lived there had stopped counting the days because counting made it worse, and hope was a luxury that ran out long before the food did. 12 million Vaynari huddled in underground shelters, while Scath warships circled above like patient vultures, and the orbital bombardment came every few hours, just enough to destroy anything they tried to rebuild, and not enough to kill them all at once, because the Scath enjoyed the slow work of breaking a species down into something that would accept slavery without resistance. The children had stopped glowing, and that was how you knew things were truly bad, because Vaynari bioluminescence was tied to emotional health, and when the light went out of a Vaynari child, it meant something inside them had given up. Then the sky changed. Admiral Cassia Orende stood on the bridge of the UHS Perseverance and watched the Aethan system resolve on her tactical display as Expeditionary Fleet Prometheus dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the system's edge, with the kind of sudden violence that made space itself shudder. She was 58 years old, and she had survived the unification wars on Earth, which meant she had survived the worst thing humans had ever done to each other, and that was saying something for a species that had spent most of its history finding creative new ways to be awful to itself, before finally deciding that maybe cooperation was worth trying. She had a scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, and she had calm, steady eyes, and she held a cup of black coffee in her right hand, because some traditions survived even the invention of starlight engines. 80 Skakath vessels in orbit around the fourth planet, her tactical officer reported. They have detected us, and they are moving to intercept. Open a channel, Orende said, not to them. The bridge crew paused. Open a channel to surface of Athen 4 and broadcast on all Vaynari emergency frequencies. The communications officer made it happen, and Orende set down her coffee and spoke in a voice that was steady and warm and carried no threat whatsoever. People of Athen 4, my name is Cassia Orende, and I am an admiral of the United Human Systems Fleet. And we received your distress beacons, and I want you to know that we heard you and we are here, and you are not alone anymore. 12 million Vaynari heard that message in their shelters, and they did not know what a human was, and they did not know where the United Human Systems existed on any star chart. But it did not matter, because someone had finally answered. The Scath commander was a warlord named Gess, and he was enormous, even by the standards of his species, which averaged 3 meters tall and were covered in armored plates and venomous spines. And he had conquered 11 worlds and eaten the leaders of 6 species, and he looked at the incoming fleet on his display, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time: uncertainty. The ships approaching him were not like anything in the Concord registry, and they were ugly and heavy and wrong in ways that made his tactical instincts itch. And he opened a channel and broadcast the standard Scath territorial claim, which was less a legal statement and more a promise of what would happen to anyone who did not turn around. Admiral Orende listened to the translation, and then she said, all ships raise shields and charge weapons, and if they fire first, I want a response so fast they think God sneezed on them. The Scath fired first. 80 warships unleashed plasma batteries and particle beams and guided munitions in a wave of destruction that would have vaporized any Concord fleet of similar size in under 4 minutes. The human ships took the hits and kept coming. This was the thing that no species in the galaxy understood about Deathworld engineering, and it was the thing that would change everything. Concord ships were beautiful and efficient, and they were built by species that evolved on garden worlds, where the weather was gentle, and the predators were manageable, and the worst natural disaster was a seasonal flood. And these species built their ships the same way they built everything else, with elegance and precision, and an assumption that nothing would go terribly wrong. Human ships were built by a species that came from a planet where everything went terribly wrong all the time. And the engineering philosophy was simple and brutal, and it could be summarized in 5 words. What if this breaks too? So everything was redundant, and everything was armored, and everything had a backup, and a manual override, and a way to be fixed with welding torches and determination, while the ship was still being shot at. The Scath plasma bolts hit the Perseverance and burned through the outer hull layer. And the second hull layer absorbed the heat, and the third hull layer did not even notice. Then the humans fired back. They used railguns, which were weapons that accelerated solid metal slugs to a significant fraction of the speed of light. And the Concord considered kinetic weapons to be primitive and barbaric. And the Scath learned in the next 90 seconds exactly how much damage a barbaric weapon could do when it hit you at 40,000 kilometers per second. Scath ships cracked open like eggs. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes, and it was not close, and it was not elegant, and it was the most violent thing the Athen system had ever witnessed. Warlord Gess watched 6 of his ships disintegrate before he understood what was happening. And by the time he ordered a retreat, his flagship had taken 4 railgun impacts and was venting atmosphere from wounds that his damage control teams could not seal fast enough. the Scath fleet scattered and ran. And, for the first time in the recorded history of the Dominion, a Scath warlord fled from prey. On the surface of Athen 4, the orbital bombardment stopped, and the silence that followed was so total and so sudden that the Vaynari did not trust it at first, because silence had tricked them before. Then the human ships entered orbit, and dropships began descending through the atmosphere. And they were not warships, but transports, carrying medical supplies, and food, and water, and shelter materials, and engineers. Tyvan Sarathi arrived 6 hours later, aboard a Concorde diplomatic shuttle, because High Command had decided that someone needed to observe the Deathworlders up close, and Tyvan had the misfortune of being the analyst who found the signal, which apparently qualified him for the job of standing next to the most dangerous species in the galaxy, and taking notes. What he found on the surface made him forget his fear for almost an entire minute. Everywhere. But they were not standing guard, or establishing perimeters, or doing any of the things a conquering army would do. They were building. They were setting up field hospitals with equipment that looked heavy and rugged and functional. And human medics were treating Vaynari wounded with a gentleness that seemed impossible from beings who had just torn a war fleet apart with metal slugs. Tyvan watched a young human soldier named Corporal Dae-Jung Park kneel in the rubble of a collapsed shelter and carefully lift a Vaynari child who weighed almost nothing in his arms. And the child was not glowing, and her eyes were closed, and Park held her against his chest and walked through air that was thick with toxins that would have killed most Concorde species in minutes. He was not wearing a breathing mask. Tyvan checked his instruments and confirmed that the atmospheric contamination levels were indeed lethal to 90% of known species, and the human was just walking through it like it was a mild inconvenience. Park carried the child to the field hospital and set her down on a treatment bed, and a medic started working, and Park turned around and walked back into the rubble to find more survivors. Tyvan stood there with his datapad in all 4 of his trembling hands, and he tried to write something coherent in his report, but all he could manage was a single sentence. They are terrifying, and they are kind, and I do not know what to do with both of those things being true at the same time. Above the planet, the human fleet held its position like a wall of steel and fury and silence, and somewhere far away, Grand Arbiter Yulin read the battle report and realized that the galaxy would never be the same. 6 weeks after the Battle of Athen 4, the name human had become the most spoken word in Concorde space, and depending on who was speaking, it was either a prayer or a warning. Fleet Prometheus had liberated 3 more systems in that time, and each liberation followed the same pattern. The humans arrived, and the Scath died, and then the humans climbed out of their ugly ships and started helping people. And this combination of extreme violence, followed by extreme kindness, was driving the entire galactic diplomatic community insane, because no one had a framework for understanding it. The Concorde Council was fracturing along lines that had not existed 6 weeks ago, and the debate was loud and frightened, and it consumed every session. Ambassador Lyriel Thaline of the Vaynari stood before the council chamber, and her bioluminescent skin pulsed with soft blue light that meant she was angry. And she spoke with the quiet fury of someone whose people had spent 11 years dying while this room debated procedure. They came for us, she said, when none of you would, and now you want to discuss whether they are a threat. And I am asking you to consider the possibility that the threat was always us and our willingness to let our own people burn while we argued about jurisdiction. Grand Arbiter Yulin floated in the center of the chamber like a cloud of pale gas with ancient eyes hidden somewhere in the mist. And when the Arbiter spoke, the chamber always fell silent, because 6 centuries of authority had a weight that pressed down on everyone in the room. The Vaynari ambassador speaks from pain, and pain is understandable. But policy cannot be built on gratitude alone, Yulin said. The humans are a Class 12 Deathworld species, and every projection model we have says that a spacefaring Deathworld civilization is the single greatest threat any galactic community can face. And the fact that they are currently being helpful, the math, Lirio repeated, and her skin turned a cold white, which meant something far beyond anger. 12 million of my people are alive because of that math you are so afraid of. The council roared with voices from 100 different species, and the sound was chaos, and it solved nothing. Meanwhile, a diplomatic delegation was sent to tour the human flagship Perseverance, because the Concord believed in understanding potential threats through direct observation. And the delegation consisted of 12 representatives from 12 different species, and not a single one of them was prepared for what they found. The ship was enormous, and it hummed with the vibration of engines that seemed too powerful for any vessel. And the corridors were wide and built from metal that showed welding marks and repair scars, like a body covered in healed wounds. And everything about it felt heavy and solid and built to endure punishment that would destroy anything the Concord had ever constructed. The delegation's first stop was what the humans called a gymnasium, and it was a large room filled with heavy objects that the humans picked up and put down repeatedly. And the delegation watched in horrified silence as a human female lifted a metal bar loaded with weight that exceeded her own body mass, and did this multiple times while making sounds of exertion that the translator flagged as distress signals. "She is damaging her own muscle tissue," the Palathi delegate whispered. "Yes," said Lieutenant Mara Vasquez, who was serving as their guide, and who was young and cheerful, and apparently unaware that she was terrifying. "That is how we make them grow back stronger, and it is called training. You deliberately injure yourselves to become more powerful," the Cathari delegate said, and all 4 of his hands were pressed flat against his thorax in a gesture of pure disbelief. "I mean, when you say it like that, it sounds weird, but yes." The second stop was the sparring ring, where 2 humans were engaged in what Vasquez described as friendly practice, and what the delegation described in their report as ritualized combat of disturbing intensity, because the 2 humans were hitting each other with their fists and feet, and they were bleeding, and they were smiling. The third stop was the mess hall, and this was where the delegation lost one of its members, because the Ulathi ambassador, who was an herbivorous crystalline species, fainted when a human cook served grilled meat, and the smell alone was enough to trigger a panic response in 3 other delegates. Admiral Orende met the delegation in the officers' mess, and she was calm and polite, and she answered their questions with patience. And when one delegate asked if humans were aware that they were clinically insane by the standards of every psychological framework in Concord science, Orende laughed. Threat display vocalization, and 2 more delegates had to sit down. But it was Tyvan Sarathi who was building the most complete picture of humanity, because he had been living among them for 6 weeks now, and he had stopped being afraid approximately 4 weeks ago, which surprised him more than anything else. He called his ongoing report the Deathworlder contradiction, and every entry added another layer to a species that refused to make sense. They were the most efficient killers the galaxy had ever produced, and they sang songs to their children at night to help them sleep. They could break bones with their bare hands, and they formed emotional attachments to machines, giving them names and talking to them as if they were alive. They consumed the flesh of other creatures, and they wept openly when one of their companion animals died of old age. They had spent most of their history at war with each other, and they had crossed the stars not to conquer, but because they heard strangers crying for help. Tyvan interviewed Corporal Park one evening, while the soldier sat on an overturned crate outside a Venari shelter, cleaning his rifle with hands that were scarred and steady. "Why did you come here?" Tyvan asked. "You did not know us, and you owe us nothing, and your own worlds are safe, and no one asked you to bleed for strangers." Park thought about it for a moment, and then he shrugged, which was a human gesture that could mean a dozen different things. But in this case, seemed to mean that the answer was obvious. "We know what it is like to suffer," Park said. "That is why we help." Tyven wrote that down and underlined it twice, and he still did not fully understand it. But he was beginning to think that maybe understanding was not the point. Then the scath changed everything. Intelligence reports came in fragments at first, and then all at once, like a dam breaking, and the picture they painted was the worst thing Tyven had ever seen rendered in data. The Scath Dominion had activated a weapon that the Concord had hoped was only a myth. It was called a Devourer, and it was a bioengineered organism the size of a small moon. It was designed to do one thing: land on a planet and eat everything alive on the surface, down to the microbial level, until nothing remained but bare rock. The Devourer had been deployed toward Cathari Prime, Tyven's homeworld. 12 billion Cathari lived on that world, including Tyven's family and his friends and everyone he had ever known. And the Concord's remaining fleet was not strong enough to stop the Devourer. High Command was already drafting evacuation orders that everyone knew would save less than 1% of the population. Tyven could not breathe, and his exoskeleton locked up, and he stood in the intelligence center of the Perseverance, surrounded by humans who were reading the same data. What the Concord always said, which was that this was regrettable, and that committees would be formed, and that thoughts were with the affected populations. Admiral Arendi read the report, and she looked at the star chart, and she calculated the distance and the time, and then she turned to her chief engineer. "How fast can we go if we remove the safety limiters on the engines?" The chief engineer stared at her, and Tyven could see the blood draining from the human's face, which was apparently something that happened when humans were frightened. "Admiral, that could kill crew members, and the G-forces alone would cause internal bleeding and bone fractures, and I asked how fast." The engineer swallowed hard. "We could shave 3 days off the transit time." Arendi nodded once, and picked up the ship-wide communicator, and her voice went out to every human on every ship in the fleet. "All hands, this is the Admiral, and I am not going to lie to you about what I am asking. And the Skakath have deployed a planet killer aimed at Cathari Prime, and 12 billion people will die if we do not get there in time. And the only way to get there in time is to push our ships past every safety limit they were built with. And some of you will be hurt, and some of you may die, and I am asking you to do it anyway for people you have never met." She paused, and the silence on every ship in the fleet was total. "If anyone objects, speak now, and no one will think less of you." No one spoke. Orende set down the communicator and looked at Tyven, whose 4 hands were shaking so badly he could not hold his datapad. "We are coming," she said, and it was not a promise to him specifically, but to all 12 billion souls on a world she had never visited, for a species she had known for 6 weeks. Tyven believed her, and that was the most frightening and wonderful thing he had ever felt. The engines screamed, and the humans screamed with them, but neither stopped. Fleet Prometheus tore through space at speeds that bent the laws of physics into shapes they were never meant to hold. And the ships shook with a constant deep vibration that rattled teeth and loosened bolts, and made the bulkheads groan like living things in pain. Admiral Orende had ordered the safety limiters removed, and the engineering teams had done it with hands that were steady and faces that were pale, because every single one of them understood what it meant, and what it meant was that the ships would go faster than they were ever designed to go, and the crews inside would pay for that speed with their bodies. The acceleration pressed down on every human aboard, like the hand of something enormous and cruel, and the G-forces climbed past the point where comfort ended, and past the point where pain began, and kept climbing into territory that the human body was never meant to visit. Human bodies were strange and stubborn things, built by a planet that had spent 4 billion years trying to kill everything on it. And the species that crawled out of that crucible had bones that could bend before they broke, and blood that clotted fast, and organs wrapped in layers of protective tissue, and a nervous system that could be told to ignore pain through sheer force of will. They strapped themselves into acceleration couches, and they injected anti-hemorrhagic compounds that thickened their blood, and they bit down on mouth guards, and they held on. In the first 12 hours, 47 crew members across the fleet suffered broken ribs, and another 31 suffered fractured wrists or ankles, and the medical bays filled with people who were hurt and who refused to stop working, because stopping meant slowing down, and slowing down meant 12 billion people would die. Corporal Park spent the burn in the Marine barracks, strapped into his couch with his squad. The acceleration made his vision narrow to a tunnel, and his chest felt like something was sitting on it, and he could hear the bones in his hands creaking every time he made a fist. The Marine next to him was a woman named Sergeant Ayala, and she had blood running from her nose in a thin line that the acceleration pulled sideways across her cheek, and she looked at Park and grinned with red teeth. "How you doin'?" she asked. "Outstanding," Park lied. "Same," Ayala lied back. And that was how humans dealt with suffering, which was to look it in the eye and lie to its face and keep going. Tyvan Sarathi was aboard the Perseverance in a compartment that the crew had specially padded for him because his Kethari exoskeleton was not built for this kind of punishment. And even with the padding, he could feel his joints grinding, and the acceleration made his vision blur, and his breathing turned shallow and rapid. Lieutenant Vasquez checked on him every 4 hours, climbing through corridors where the gravity was so wrong that walking was an act of defiance. And she brought nutrient paste and water, and she re-splinted the cracks that were forming along his left forearm carapace with medical tape and steady hands. "You are injured," Tyvan said to her, because he could see the way she held her torso stiff and careful. "Just some cracked ribs," she said, in a tone that suggested cracked ribs were slightly less important than a mild headache. "How many?" "3 and maybe 4, but I would check later." "Later," Tyvan repeated. "When we get there," Vasquez said, and she smiled at him, and he realized that she meant it, and that she was genuinely planning to ignore 4 broken ribs until the mission was complete, because the mission was more important than her pain. And this was not bravery in the way Tyvan understood bravery, which was the absence of fear, but something else entirely, which was the decision to keep moving when every part of you was screaming to stop. Day 3 of the burn was when the first death happened. An engineer on the destroyer UHS Haldane suffered a cerebral hemorrhage from the sustained G-forces, and she died in the engine room with a wrench still in her hand because she had been tightening a coolant coupling when the blood vessel in her brain gave way. Her name was Petty Officer Suyin Chen, and she was 31 years old, and her crewmates carried her body to the ship's morgue, and then they went back to work because there was nothing else they could do for her except finish what she started. Admiral Arende received the casualty report on the bridge, where she sat in her command chair with a fractured collarbone that she had not told anyone about. And she read the name, and she added it to the list she was keeping in her head, which was a list of people she owed a debt to that she could never repay. On day 5, the fleet crossed into Concord-controlled space, and they were intercepted by a Concord patrol squadron that ordered them to halt and identify themselves. And Arende did not slow down, because slowing down was not an option. And she broadcast her identification and her mission parameters, and told the Concord ships to either help or get out of the way. They got out of the way. Ambassador Liriel Feline had been busy during those 5 days, and the broadcast she sent across every Concord communication network reached 4,000 species on 100,000 worlds, and it was short, and it was devastating. Right now at this moment, a fleet of strangers from a world we locked away and tried to forget is burning through space so fast that it is killing them. And they are doing this for Cathari Prime, and they are doing this for people they have never met. And they are bleeding, and they are dying, and they are not stopping. And while they do this, our own fleets sit in dock, and our councils debate, and our leaders calculate political costs. And I am asking every species that can hear this message one simple question. And the question is, what are we? The message hit like a shockwave, and something shifted in the Concord that day. Because shame is a powerful force when it is deserved. On day 7, Tyven could barely move, and his exoskeleton had cracked in 6 places, and Vasquez had run out of medical tape, and was using strips of her own uniform to hold his limbs together. And she had not slept in 30 hours, and her cracked ribs had become definitely 4, and possibly 5. "Why are you doing this?" Tyven asked her, and his voice was thin and reedy from the pressure. "Doing what?" "Taking care of me when you are hurt and exhausted, and you could be resting." Vasquez looked at him with eyes that were bloodshot and ringed with dark circles, and she said, "Because you are my friend, Tyven, and where I come from we do not leave friends to hurt alone." He had known her for 6 weeks, and she already considered him a friend, and she was destroying herself to take care of him. And this was so far outside the boundaries of anything he understood about interspecies relations that he could not speak for a long time. On day 8, the long-range sensors picked up Cathari Prime, and they picked up something else. The Devourer was already visible on the scopes, a biological mass the size of a small moon, moving with terrible, slow purpose toward Tyven's homeworld. And behind it, like shadows waiting to feast, sat 500 Scath warships, arranged in a formation that said very clearly, "This is a trap, and we are ready for you." Admiral Arende studied the tactical display, and she did the math in her head. And the math was bad, because 247 human ships against 500 Scath warships, plus a planet-eating bioweapon, were not good odds by any standard. She drank her coffee, which had gone cold hours ago, and she set the cup down, and she stood up. Standing sent a spike of pain through her broken collarbone that made her vision go white for a full second. "Time to arrival," she asked. 6 hours, the navigator said. "The Devourer reaches Cathari Prime in 9 hours. Then we have 3 hours to kill that thing and break their fleet before it touches the atmosphere." Her tactical officer looked at her and said, "Admiral, the odds are—" "I know what the odds are," Arende said. "I also know that there are 12 billion people down there who are looking at the sky right now and hoping that someone is coming, and I am not going to be the reason their hope was wasted." She opened a fleet-wide channel one more time. "All ships, this is the Admiral, and we arrive in 6 hours, and every one of you has been in pain for 8 days, and I know you are tired, and I know you are hurt, and I know some of you are wondering if we can do this, and I am telling you we can, because we are human, and the galaxy has not yet figured out what that means, but today we are going to show them." She closed the channel and sat back down and reached for her coffee and finished it. Somewhere ahead in the dark, the Devourer moved, and the Scath waited, and Cathari Prime turned slowly beneath its sun, and 12 billion souls looked up and hoped. And behind them, burning through the void like a fist made of steel and willpower and cracked bones, Fleet Prometheus came. Fleet Prometheus dropped out of faster-than-light travel like a hammer coming down on glass, and 247 human warships, battered and scarred and crewed by people who had been braking for 8 days, arranged themselves between the Devourer and the world it had come to eat. Cathari Prime hung in space behind them, blue and green and swirling with clouds, and on the surface, 12 billion beings watched their skies fill with sensor alerts and emergency broadcasts, and they did not know yet whether salvation or extinction had arrived. Admiral Arende stood on the bridge of the Perseverance with her fractured collarbone and her cold coffee and her steady eyes, and she opened a channel to the Scath Armada. This is Admiral Cassia Arende of the United Human Systems, and you are in range of our guns, and you have 60 seconds to withdraw before we show you what a Deathworld species does when it is angry. The Scath Warlord Supreme, Guess the Unbroken, had survived the humiliation at Athen 4, and who had spent the week since then nursing a rage that consumed every waking thought, responded with a sound that the translator could only render as contempt and hunger combined, and he ordered his 500 warships to advance. "Well," Arende said, "I gave them a chance." She set down her coffee. "All ships, weapons free." The Battle of Kethari Prime began with the Devourer, because the bioweapon was the immediate threat, and nothing else mattered if it reached the atmosphere. The thing was the size of a small moon, and it was alive in the worst possible way, with a hide that regenerated faster than energy weapons could burn it, and a core that pulsed with a biological intelligence that understood only one directive, which was to consume everything organic on whatever world it touched. Concord scientists had theorized that the Devourer was invulnerable to conventional weapons, and that the only defense was evacuation, and the Concord had been right about the conventional part. Humans did not fight with conventional weapons. Admiral Arende gave the order, and the fleet launched the first volley of nuclear-tipped kinetic penetrators, which were railgun slugs carrying fusion warheads that detonated after impact. And these weapons were so destructive and so indiscriminate that the Concord had banned them 1,000 years ago by universal treaty. Humanity had never signed that treaty because humanity had not been invited, because humanity had been quarantined behind a wall of fear and forgotten. The first volley hit the Devourer and punched through its regenerating hide and detonated inside its body, and the explosion was so bright that automatic filters kicked in on every ship in the fleet, and when the light cleared, the Devourer was wounded with a crater the size of a city burning in its flank. It screamed on frequencies that crossed the boundary between sound and psychic energy, and every telepathic species within 3 light-years felt it like a needle through the brain. The Devourer kept coming. Arende ordered a second volley, and a third, and a fourth, and each one carved deeper into the thing's body. And the regeneration slowed, and the screaming grew louder and more desperate, and on the 5th volley the penetrators reached the core. The Devourer died the way a star dies, which was with a burst of light and fury that briefly outshone the sun, and the shockwave pushed the nearest human ships backward and cracked hulls that were already damaged. And it did not matter, because the planet killer was dead, and Kethari Prime was still alive. Then the scath hit them. 500 warships crashed into the human fleet like a wave of bladed metal, and the battle became the largest and most violent engagement in the recorded history of the galaxy. The scath fought the way they always fought, which was with overwhelming aggression, belief that the strongest had the right to consume the weak, and they outnumbered the humans 2-to-1. And their ships were fast and vicious and armed with weapons designed to crack open prey. But the humans did not fight like prey. Human ships fought in pairs, covering each other, rotating damaged vessels to the rear, while fresh ones pushed forward. And when a ship was too damaged to fire its weapons, it turned its armored prow toward the enemy, and became a shield for the ships behind it. The Concord border fleet arrived 90 minutes into the battle, and they were battered and undersized, and they had come because Ambassador Lyriel's broadcast had shamed them into action. And when they saw the scale of what was happening, they almost turned back. They did not turn back. The Concord ships were fragile compared to human vessels, but they added numbers, and they added fire, and they fought alongside humans for the first time in history. More than the tactical advantage it provided. When Scath ships were crippled, they triggered self-destruct charges, because surrender was not a concept the Dominion recognized. And Admiral Arende realized that the cargo bays of those dying ships were full of slaves from a dozen conquered species. And she gave an order that no Scath commander could have predicted. Marine boarding teams I want you on those ships before they blow, and I want you to save everyone inside." Human Marines in powered armor launched from their ships in boarding pods, and they breached Scath hulls with cutting charges. And they fought through corridors filled with venomous spined predators 3 meters tall. And they did it, not to capture the ships, but to reach the cargo bays and pull the slaves out before the self-destructs fired. Corporal Park was among the first through the breach on a Scath cruiser, and he fought his way through 3 decks of resistance with his squad. The cargo bay. They found 11 Venari juveniles, chained to the floor, with restraints designed for creatures 5 times their size. Park ripped the chains out of the floor with his powered gauntlets, and he picked up the children, and he carried them, and when the self-destruct alarm started counting down, he ran with 11 small bodies clinging to him, and he made it to the boarding pod with 4 seconds to spare. The cruiser detonated behind him, and the shock waves slammed the pod sideways, and Park held the children against his chest and took the impact with his body, and something in his back broke, and he did not let go. The battle turned when Warlord Supreme Guess, the Unbroken, made his final move, and it was the move of a predator that had been cornered and had decided that if it could not win, it would at least kill the enemy's leader. Guess rammed his dreadnought directly into the Perseverance. The collision tore open 6 decks, and Scath boarding parties flooded through the breach, and hand-to-hand combat erupted in the corridors of the human flagship. The Scath were apex predators on their homeworld, and they were 3 meters tall and covered in natural armor, and their spines carried venom that could paralyze most species in seconds. They had never fought humans in close quarters. Humans were smaller and softer, and they had no natural weapons worth mentioning, and they should have been easy prey. And for the first 30 seconds of the engagement, the Scath believed they were winning. Then the humans adapted. This was the thing about Deathworld species, and the thing that the quarantine had been designed to prevent the galaxy from ever learning. And it was simple and terrible. Humans were persistence predators. They did not need to be the strongest, or the fastest, or the most venomous, because they were the thing that did not stop. And they learned in real time, and they adjusted. And what did not work, first time worked the second time, and what did not work the second time was abandoned for something new on the 3rd attempt. The Scath venom did not work through the human's armor, so the Scath tried to tear the armor off, and the humans responded by fighting in tight formations that protected each other's weak points. And the Scath tried to use their size advantage, and the humans responded by going low and targeting joints. And the Scath tried to retreat and regroup, and the humans followed them without hesitation. Guess the Unbroken fought his way to the bridge deck, because killing the enemy commander was the only victory left available to him. And he broke through a security door with his bare claws, and found Admiral Arende standing behind her command chair, with a sidearm in her hand, and blood on her face from a cut above her eye. She was smaller than him by a full meter, and she weighed less than half of what he weighed, and she was injured and exhausted. At him with those steady, calm eyes, and she did not step back. Guess roared and charged, and Arende shot him 6 times in the space between his armor plates, and when he kept coming, because Scath were nearly as hard to kill as humans, she sidestepped his charge and drove a combat knife into the nerve cluster at the base of his skull. Guess the Unbroken fell on the deck of a human warship, and the last thing he saw was a small, soft creature from a quarantined hellworld standing over him, and he finally understood why the quarantine had existed. The battle ended 3 hours later, when the last Scath ships either fled or were destroyed, and the silence that followed was the loudest silence Tyvan had ever heard. In the days that came, everything changed. Grand Arbiter Yulin resigned, and the ancient Palathi drifted away from the council chamber for the last time, and no one tried to stop the departure, because the time for caution and quarantine and fear had ended. The Concord formally dissolved the Sol Arm quarantine, and humanity was offered a seat on the Galactic Council, and the invitation was delivered by Ambassador Lyriel Feline, personally, because she had fought harder for this moment than anyone. Admiral Oranday attended the ceremony in a dress uniform that hid the bandages underneath, and she did not give a victory speech because she did not believe in victory speeches. Instead, she read names. She read the names of every human who died in the campaign, and there were 412 of them, and she read each name slowly and clearly, and the chamber was silent. Then she read another list. The names of every Concord citizen who died in the Skakth Wars during the years when the galaxy did nothing and the beacons went unanswered. And this list was long, and it took 4 hours, and by the end, there was not a single species in the chamber that could meet her eyes. She stepped down from the podium, said nothing else, because the names had said everything. Tyvan Sarathi published his report 3 weeks later, and he titled it The Deathworlder Contradiction, and it became the most widely read document in the history of the Galactic Concord. The conclusion read as follows: They are everything we feared, and they are strong where we are fragile, and violent where we are gentle, and stubborn where we are flexible, and they eat death and breathe poison, and by every metric of civilized analysis they should be monsters. But they cross the stars not to conquer and not to consume, but because they heard someone crying for help, and they could not bear to do nothing. And I do not understand them, and I do not think I ever will, but I am alive because of them, and my world is alive because of them, and perhaps understanding is not required, and perhaps it is enough to simply be grateful. On Athen 4, 6 months later, the rebuilding was nearly complete. Had spent 3 years dying, was learning how to live again. Corporal Dae-jung Park sat on the steps of a school that human engineers had helped rebuild, and his back still ached from where it had broken on the boarding pod. And he would carry that pain for the rest of his life, and he did not regret it. Venari children played around him in the warm light of their local star, and they were glowing again, soft blues and greens and golds, pulsing with the light that meant they were happy and safe and alive. One of the children climbed into his lap, which she did every day, because she was the same child he had carried out of the rubble of Athen 4 all those months ago. And she looked up at him with wide, luminous eyes. "Why are humans so warm?" she asked. Park smiled, and the smile was tired and honest and full of something that transcended species and language, and the vast, cold distance between stars. "Because our world tried very hard to kill us," he said, "learned to burn bright. Above them, the sky was clear and the stars were quiet. For now."